So I just finished speaking on some of the mechanisms that are involved around fluid shift and water shifts within the body. So now we're going to go into some more practical application stuff. So just evaluating your status. Like, how do you know if you're hydrated enough? There is an element of subjectivity to it. There's an element of individuality to it. But the textbook offers 3 guidelines to pay attention to. And the first is simply thirst. If you are thirsty, you may be slightly dehydrated and drink some water, drink some fluids. And this should be obvious, right? Go by feel. The next one is urine color. And the rule of thumb is a pretty good rule of thumb. You know, the clearer your urine, the more hydrated you are. You don't need this crystal clear urine all the time. But conversely, if you have this kind of dark urine color, you are likely to be dehydrated. So I would pay attention to especially trying to avoid that dark urine color. And there's an example of this on page 251. And then additionally, you can go by body weight. So whether you do this kind of in the morning or post exercise, both options are valid. In general, right, 1 kilogram of body weight lost is going to equate to about 1 liter of water. So if you go out and exercise and you find after you exercise that you weigh about 2 kilos lighter, right, 4.4 pounds, you should have approximately 2 liters of water to replenish that. And conversely, you could do this in the morning, right? So, sometimes you go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, or you go to the bathroom when you wake up, and you weigh yourself at the end of the night, and you weigh yourself in the morning. And if you see that you're, I don't know, a kilogram lighter in the morning, you may need 1 liter of water to help replenish that. I think, as the book put it, use all 3 of these. No one tool is perfect. But if you have all 3 of these and you're not thirsty, you've got a relatively clear urine, and post exercise or when you wake up in the morning you haven't lost too much weight, these are all good tools to use in conjunction with each other. Conversely, if you're thirsty, you've got really dark urine color, and you're down 4 pounds from where you would normally be in the morning, you are probably a bit dehydrated and must actually rehydrate. I think, so a lot of people want something simple, right? Simple is what everyone looks for. And this is just me when working with people. They ask me, how much water should I drink? And the simplest recommendation, just like with protein, I like to make a simple recommendation. A simple recommendation is drinking half of your body weight in ounces. So 110-pound female should drink at least 55 ounces of water throughout the day, or fluids throughout the day. And I starred this where it is a loose guideline, right? This is going to heavily depend on your activity level. It's going to heavily depend on the intensity of your activity, whether if you are exercising, are you a heavy sweater or not? It's going to majorly depend on your environment. If you live in a hot environment, or if you're working out in a hot environment, that number is going to go up dramatically. Are you working out twice a week, or are you working out 7 sessions per week? So that number will vary dramatically, season, winter versus summer. But I think a loose rule of thumb, on average, if you're drinking half of your body weight, that's also helpful, in addition to using those 3 guidelines provided: thirst, urine color, and body weight. So training recommendations. These are pretty simple. I took them straight from the text. I tend to lean that more people nowadays are overhydrating, right? So I think, like, for that pre-training, that 2 to 4 hour window, right? A female, 110-pound female, should be taking in approximately 8 to 16 ounces in the 2 to 4 hours pre-workout. During training, it's important to understand that we do have a maximum absorption rate, right? The maximum amount of water we can actually absorb from our intestines. So you can drink more than a liter for sure, but are you actually going to be able to utilize that and absorb that? And the answer is no, it's about a liter per hour. So because of that, right, our standard recommendation is approximately 6 to 12 ounces every 15 to 20 minutes. Because if you drank more than 12 ounces every 20 minutes, you'd be ingesting more than a liter, right? Do not forget where if you're exercising for an extended period of time, you are going to need to help maintain that sodium water balance. So you should be ingesting approximately a gram of sodium per hour when you're exercising over 2 hours. And this goes in addition to carbohydrates, because remember, we do have a limited amount of blood glucose and glycogen stored in our body. You should be supplementing with carbohydrates as well. That 6 to 8% solution, which is what most sports drinks are, is usually what we're looking for. Otherwise, if it's anything higher, it may lead to some gastric distress. Another real quick thing about training that I don't have on here is if you're in short exercise bouts, you do not need to hydrate. So what do I mean? Like if you're partaking in something that's 5 minutes or less, 10 minutes or less, 15 minutes or less, you don't really need to hydrate. It's not going to negatively affect your performance. We have research that shows that. So again, if you have like a quick sporting event, whatever it is, you don't need to have this continuous hydration, or you don't need to down an entire liter of water. It's not going to negatively affect your performance. In that post-training window, the text used something that I wasn't familiar with, but I kind of like the saying a pint per pound in that post-training window, and it should be slightly greater than this. So if you lose 2 pounds, something greater than a pint per pound, so something greater than 2 pints would be enough to replenish that fluid lost. All right. So one situation you may encounter when working with clients is a state of hyponatremia. So what is this? Essentially, it's when the sodium concentrations within our extracellular fluid rapidly fall below 130 millimoles per liter, right? So we talked about this a little bit on the last one, and essentially what happens is because our sodium concentrations are so low, which means we have a lot of water and a relatively lower amount of sodium, the water must shift, right? That osmotic pressure must shift from the extracellular fluid to the intracellular fluid, so we can maintain that number, which is essentially anything above 130 millimoles per liter. And as water shifts from to the intracellular fluid, right, these cells swell, right? And some of the cells we have to be very careful about, right? Specifically, our nerve cells, right? As our nerve cells swell, right, this could impair their function, and this could lead to things like confusion, dizziness, or even death, right? So in the real world, right, we're taught stay hydrated, stay hydrated, stay hydrated. It's so important. And to some extent, some people talk about sodium or they just use a blanket term like electrolytes, right? But for the most part, we're taught to stay hydrated, drink water, drink water, drink water. But we're not really taught told what's happening, and we're definitely not told, though, take sodium, at least not to the average public, right? So that whole stay hydrated mantra can really lead to this hypotrenemic state, right? So we have to be very careful. Now, some people might say, oh, is this common? And the answer is it depends on your sport, probably. So in a sport like, I don't know, a high school basketball game, which lasts less than 60 minutes, a collegiate football game where you're on and off the field, and you're probably, resting and hydrating, or excuse me, you're probably supplementing in between plays. Probably not as much. In endurance sports that last greater than 2 hours, probably greater than 4 hours, it's much more common than you would think, right? So the book lists a study from Speedy et al. Ironic name. but the author's name was Speedy, and they actually did a field trial where they went out into the field. So the participants didn't come into the lab. They went out into the fields at an actual Ironman triathlon. So for those of you that don't know what an Ironman triathlon is, it's essentially a 2.4 mile swim, immediately followed by a 112 mile bike ride, immediately followed by a marathon. So think about that, right? Like you swim for 2.4 miles, you bike for over 100 miles, and then you follow that up with a marathon just to top it off. So it's an extreme endurance event. Your average Ironman length, at the elite levels is like 9 hours, give or take, but your average participant is probably in that 12 to 14 hour range. So they're exercising for 12 to 14 hours. And because of this, right, I tend to think triathletes are a little bit more self-aware of things that they should be taking in. But even then, with this study, they found that 17% of athletes were clinically hypotronemic, right? What they probably were doing is they were ingesting incredible amounts of water to stay hydrated, just like the saying says, but were not paying enough attention to sodium intake, right? So to avoid this state, like what's the take-home message? Avoid overconsumption of fluids, right? So we have to be careful, stick to those recommendations that I provided on the prior slide. And when exercising for greater than 2 hours, right, you should probably be supplementing with sodium, also provided on the last slide, approximately 1 gram per hour. So let's move on. You know what? Let's tell a little story. We've got a few minutes here. I've competed in a half Ironman triathlon. So a half Ironman triathlon is exactly that, half the distances, a 1.2 mile swim, a 56 mile bike ride, and a 13.1 mile run. I've done lots of other things, half marathons and other triathlons before, and I never really had any issues with nutrition in any other events. So like no cramping, no what we would call like hitting the wall, right? I didn't run out of ATP or carbs. I would never say that, but I didn't hit the wall, right? Never any issues whatsoever. And I'll never forget this. I hit the wall so hard in this half Ironman. It was just kind of unbelievable. I started averaging something like, I want to say like 18 miles per hour on the bike for the first like 30 miles of my bike ride. And then the last 10, 15 miles, I was probably averaging something like 10 miles an hour or less, which is pathetic. But the big thing was I go on to the run, and as I start the run, I'm feeling okay, but not great. And I'll never forget, because this has never happened to me any other time. I get to a slight downhill, and all of a sudden, my hamstring just completely like spazzes and cramps. I'm only 2 miles into the run, maybe less. And I had to stop and walk for a second, and I'm holding my hamstring as I'm coming down. And as, like 20 seconds into me kind of hobbling along, a guy going up the hill in the opposite direction sees me and says, "Here, come take this." He throws a couple sodium tablets in my mouth, pours the water in my mouth. I get those down. I was at first afraid I wasn't going to be able to finish this, because I've never had any type of cramp like this. And I was only 2 miles in. I had another 11 miles. I walked for a solid 2 minutes to kind of shake out the cramp. And pretty quickly I started with a very slow jog right after that. And from a slow jog, I progressed into my normal running speed. And I'd never had a cramp again after that in the hamstring for that race. So that's just an anecdotal story. Could it be related to the sodium? Maybe, maybe not. Not sure. But I don't know, just a little story for you guys. Okay, the last thing, right? So another example of things that happen in the real world is making weight, right? So this is essentially like a rapid dehydration combined with extreme weight loss methodologies to achieve a certain number in a specific sport. Usually we're talking like combat sports like MMA, could be wrestling, boxing, or in barbell sports like powerlifting or weightlifting. I personally have tried some a little rather extreme weight loss experiments on myself. I've had a few clients do them, always within the relatively safe range, however. The textbook provides some examples. In fact, there's like a spotlight example talking about collegiate wrestlers, three of which died in a 1 month time span in the 1990s. And these wrestlers were utilizing beyond extreme methodologies, where there was one wrestler trying to lose something like 40 pounds within 1 week. So what were some of the methodologies that these guys use? It's usually some combination of all these. At the most extreme end, you will see some people kind of combining all of these, which I would never ever recommend. So usually it's a reduction in food intake, specifically carbohydrate intake, because we know carbohydrates retain water. This is also supplemented with a reduction in water intake, and at times people are going to increase their exercise, sometimes in like sweatsuits. They'll take diuretics. They'll sometimes sit in a sauna, and probably the most extreme end is actually purposely vomiting. So if you combine all of these, ridiculous amounts of weight loss are possible, but obviously it is not healthy. Hypohydration basically is when you're in that that dehydrated state, right? Or the process of dehydrating you. And what happens is it increases your core temperature. As your core temperature increases, you don't have any water, right? So you don't have any water to sweat. So this is going to negatively affect your thermoregulation, and just continuously your body temperature is going to increase. So imagine like a wrestler who hasn't been taking any water, right, the day before a meet or the day before a weigh-in, and in addition to not having any water, they're running in sweatsuits in, I don't know, maybe in a room where the temperature is all jacked up, right? Their core temperature is going to go through the roof. And obviously we have a natural homeostatic temperature that we're trying to maintain. And as it goes up, this can actually lead to death. So we have to be very careful when we are trying to approach making weight in certain sports. I didn't put any recommendations for how to avoid these rapid dehydration states. But the first thing if you're trying to make weight in a sport would be to see if just a long weight reduction methodology with a negative caloric balance will do it. So just run a caloric deficit, whatever it is, 500, 600, 800 calories below your total daily energy expenditure, and see if you can make weight that way. Other ideas, in that immediate few days prior to competition, depending on your sport, maybe a severe reduction in carbohydrate intake. So in reducing your carbohydrates to somewhere to 50 to 100 grams can definitely significantly lower weight. Getting rid of other water retaining foods. So a thing that I've used in the past is completely eliminate creatine, because creatine does increase your water weight in some persons. And then lastly, sometimes reducing sodium intake. So these are things that you can do without cutting off your water, which is obviously going to help with core temperature. Now, can a drop in carbohydrates reduce performance? Possibly, for sure. Can a drop in creatine help reduce explosive performance? Possibly. As with everything, you have to be very careful, and everything should be individualized. It should be done in training. It should be moderated, and just have to be very, very individualized with your approaches.